The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, and Lars Ericsson hadn't touched his woodpile in 48 hours. While neighboring trappers burned through their winter supplies, fighting to keep fires alive, the stones beneath his cabin floor radiated steady warmth into the darkness, asking nothing in return. Before we continue, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom fascinate you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. Lars Ericsson had survived 8 winters in the Montana wilderness, and he understood cold the way a sailor understands tides. He knew how frost formed on the inside of cabin walls when temperatures dropped below zero. He knew the sound snow made when it was cold enough to squeak under boots. He knew that a man who underestimated January in the Rockies would not live to see February. These were not lessons learned from books. They were carved into memory through experience, attention, and the kind of respect for nature that kept a man breathing. The cabin Lars shared with Thomas Whitlock sat in a small clearing 3 miles east of the Gallatin River, surrounded by lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. They had built it in the autumn of 1839, following the standard construction methods every trapper knew. Logs notched at corners, chinked with moss and clay, a single door facing south, one window covered with oiled paper, and a stone fireplace in the north wall. The structure measured 16 feet by 14 feet inside, with a dirt floor covered by split pine planks near the sleeping platforms. It was functional, drafty, and typical of dozens of similar cabins scattered across the territory. Thomas was the better trapper. He read sign like other men read newspapers, and he could predict where beaver would build dams with uncanny accuracy. Lars was the better builder. He understood how logs settled, how to cut notches that tightened rather than loosened over time, and how to construct a fireplace that drew smoke properly instead of filling the cabin with choking haze. Together, they made a competent team. Their first winter had been profitable. Their second winter had been even better. By December of 1840, they had enough pelts stored to make the spring trip to St. Louis worthwhile, and enough supplies to last until April. The winter had been unusually mild through November and most of December. Lars found this concerning rather than comforting. Mild early winters in the mountains often preceded brutal late winters, as if nature was gathering strength for a harder blow. Thomas disagreed. He thought they were simply having good luck and should enjoy it while it lasted. On December 19th, Thomas decided to make a supply run to Fort Benton, 60 miles north. They needed powder and lead, and Thomas wanted to trade some early-season furs for coffee and sugar before prices rose after the holiday season. Lars suggested waiting. The sky had a peculiar clarity that morning, the kind of hard blue that often preceded weather changes. The air felt strange, too still, as if the wind was holding its breath. Thomas laughed at the worry. The fort was 3 days' travel there and back. He would return before Christmas with supplies and possibly news from other trappers wintering in the region. He left on the morning of December 20th, leading his pack horse, rifle across his saddle, confident and competent. Lars watched him disappear into the trees heading north and felt an unease he could not rationally explain. He returned to the cabin and spent the afternoon checking their firewood supply. The storm arrived on the evening of December 22nd. Lars had spent 2 days cutting additional firewood, driven by instinct rather than logic. By the time the first flakes began falling, he had split and stacked enough wood to last a normal week. The snowfall started gently, almost peaceful, but the temperature dropped with shocking speed. By midnight, the wind had risen to a howl that made the cabin walls shudder. By dawn on December 23rd, Lars could barely see 10 feet beyond his window through the horizontal sheets of snow. He had experienced blizzards before, but this one felt different. The wind did not gust and fade like normal storms. It maintained a constant, terrible pressure that found every gap in the cabin's construction. Despite the chinked logs, cold air leaked through in dozens of invisible streams. Lars kept the fire burning hot, feeding it steadily, but the heat seemed to vanish into the walls and roof. The area within 5 feet of the fireplace was tolerably warm. Beyond that distance, his breath formed clouds. He wore his heaviest wool coat inside the cabin. Thomas did not return on the 23rd. Lars had not expected him to. No one traveled during whiteout conditions unless they were desperate or lost. Thomas was neither. He would have taken shelter at the fort or found refuge at another trapper's camp along the route. Lars was not worried yet. He was simply alone with a fire that demanded constant attention. Every 2 hours, he added wood. Every 4 hours, he stepped outside briefly to bring in more from the woodpile, moving through drifts that now reached above his knees. The storm showed no signs of weakening. On December 24th, the wind increased. Lars had never heard anything like it. The sound was not a howl, but a roar, as if some massive creature was trying to tear the cabin from its foundation. Snow found its way through gaps he had not known existed. Small drifts formed on the floor near the door and window. He stuffed rags into the worst gaps, but the cold remained relentless. He burned wood at a rate he knew was unsustainable, but he had no choice. Without the fire, the cabin would become a tomb. Christmas morning arrived with no change. The storm raged into its 4th day. Lars realized his wood supply was depleting faster than anticipated. He made a calculation based on the remaining stack outside. If the storm lasted another 3 days, he would run out. He began rationing fire, letting it burn lower, enduring greater cold to conserve fuel. The cabin temperature dropped until ice formed on the water bucket. He wrapped himself in blankets and buffalo robes, but the cold penetrated everything. On the night of December 26th, exhaustion finally overwhelmed discipline. Lars had not slept more than brief intervals in 4 days. The fire required attention every 2 hours, and the physical effort of bringing in wood through chest-deep drifts was draining his strength. He sat near the fireplace, intending to rest for only a few minutes. He fell into deep sleep. The fire burned down to coals, then to ashes, then went out completely. Lars woke to absolute cold. His first confused thought was that he had somehow ended up outside. Then awareness returned with terrible clarity. The fire was dead. The cabin was dark except for gray pre-dawn light filtering through the window. His body felt strange, sluggish, as if his blood had thickened. He tried to stand and nearly fell. His fingers would not bend properly. He recognized the signs. He was hypothermic, not severely, but far enough along that another hour of sleep would have killed him. He forced his hands to work, fumbling with kindling, striking sparks with fingers that felt like wood. The first attempts failed. He made himself slow down, focus, control the shaking. Finally, a spark caught. He nursed the tiny flame with breath and splinters until it grew strong enough to accept larger pieces. Within 20 minutes, he had a proper fire burning. Within an hour, feeling returned to his extremities along with fierce pain. He had come within perhaps 2 hours of freezing to death inside his own cabin beside an adequate wood supply simply because he had fallen asleep. The storm broke on December 27th. The wind died suddenly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the occasional crack of overburdened tree branches giving way under snow weight. Lars waited until full daylight, then dressed in every layer he owned and stepped outside. The world had been transformed. Snow reached above his waist in the clearing, higher where drifts had formed. The sky was clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that made inhaling painful. He made his way to the woodpile and spent 2 hours digging out enough fuel to replenish what he had burned. Thomas should have returned by now. Even accounting for storm delays, even assuming he had waited out the weather at the fort, he should be back. Lars felt the certainty settling in his chest like a stone. Something was wrong. He spent December 28th preparing. He packed minimal supplies, loaded his rifle, and at first light on the 29th, he began following the route Thomas would have taken returning from the north. The snow made tracking impossible and travel exhausting. Lars broke trail through drifts, following the general line Thomas would have used, checking areas where a traveler might have taken shelter. He found nothing the first day and made camp in a shallow cave formed by fallen boulders. The second day, 3 miles from the cabin, in a small ravine sheltered by spruce trees, he found Thomas. His partner had tried to build a fire. The evidence was there in the small cleared area, the arrangement of wood, the scatter of burned matches, but the wind in the ravine had been too strong, or the wood too wet, or Thomas too exhausted and cold to succeed. He had died sitting against a tree trunk, wrapped in his blankets, his rifle across his lap. The snow had covered him partially. He looked almost peaceful. Lars knew better. Thomas had frozen slowly, fighting sleep, knowing what was coming, unable to prevent it. Lars buried Thomas on a hillside above the ravine, piling stones over the grave to protect it from animals. He marked the spot with a cross made from pine branches lashed together with leather cord. He spoke no words. There were no words adequate for what had happened. Thomas had died beside the materials needed for survival. He had wood, matches, and shelter. He had died anyway because fire, the foundation of frontier survival, had failed him when exhaustion and cold made it impossible to maintain. Lars returned to his cabin on January 2nd, 1841. He should have felt relief at being home, but instead he felt haunted by a question that would not leave him alone. Thomas had not died from lack of resources. He had died because staying alive required constant effort, constant attention to flame. The fire demanded feeding, it demanded watching, it demanded that a man stay awake and functional even when his body desperately needed rest. One lapse, one moment of human weakness, and the cold claimed victory. For 3 days, Lars sat in his cabin thinking. He kept his own fire burning, but now he watched it with different eyes. He noticed how quickly the heat dissipated. He noticed how the warmth existed only in the immediate area around the fireplace. He noticed how the logs burned down to ash, all that heat vanishing up the chimney, wasted. He thought about the moment he had fallen asleep and nearly died. He thought about Thomas sitting in that ravine, too cold and tired to keep matches lit. On January 6th, Lars noticed something that changed everything. He had let his fire burn down to coals while he worked on repairing a snowshoe. Hours later, when he approached the fireplace to rebuild the fire, he touched one of the large stones forming the hearth. It was still warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding air. The fire had been reduced to faint embers for at least 3 hours, yet the stone had retained heat. He began experimenting. He built his fire hot and placed different stones near the flames: river stones, granite, sandstone, slate. He heated them thoroughly, then moved them away from the fire and monitored how long they stayed warm. The results fascinated him. Dense, flat stones retained heat far longer than irregular or porous ones. A piece of sandstone he heated for 2 hours remained noticeably warm for more than 6 hours afterward. The stone was storing heat, holding it, releasing it slowly. Lars remembered his childhood in a Finnish settlement in Michigan. His grandmother had spoken of saunas heated by stones, how the stones would be heated for hours, then would keep the sauna warm long after the fire died. He had not understood the principle then. He understood it now. Heat could be captured. Heat could be stored. Heat could work for you even after the fire that created it was gone. The question was whether this principle could be applied to survival. Lars began construction on January 15th. His plan seemed simple on its surface, but required precision he had never attempted before. He would cut a trench through his floor planks, line it with stone walls, and create a channel where heated stones could radiate warmth upward into the living space. The concept made sense in his mind. Translating it into reality proved far more difficult. He started by carefully removing floor planks near his sleeping platform. Each plank was 12 inches wide and 8 feet long, fitted tightly together. He used a thin saw blade to cut along the joints, working slowly to avoid splitting the wood. He removed 6 planks, creating a rectangular opening approximately 4 feet long and 3 feet wide. Beneath the planks lay the earth floor he had covered when building the cabin. He began digging. The ground was partially frozen despite being inside the cabin. Lars used a short-handled pick to break through the frozen layer, then shoveled out loose dirt. He dug down 18 inches, creating a trench with vertical sides. The depth was crucial. Too shallow, and the stones would not retain enough heat. Too deep, and the system would be difficult to load and maintain. 18 inches felt right, though he was working purely on instinct and theory. The stone wall construction consumed 3 weeks. Lars needed flat stones of varying sizes that could be fitted together to create stable vertical walls. He found them in a creek bed half a mile from the cabin, breaking through ice to retrieve stones from the frozen stream bed. He selected each stone carefully, looking for flat surfaces and right angles. He hauled them back to the cabin in a canvas sling, making dozens of trips. Building the walls required patience he did not know he possessed. Each stone had to be placed so its weight rested solidly on the stones beneath it. Each layer had to be level, or the wall would eventually collapse. He used small stones as shims, adjusting and readjusting until each larger stone sat stable. He built the walls up from the trench bottom, creating a stone-lined channel that rose to just below floor level. The walls were 2 stones thick, providing insulation and structural strength. When Henry Caldwell stopped by on February 8th, he stared at the project with obvious confusion. Lars was kneeling beside the trench, carefully fitting a capstone along the top edge of the wall. Henry asked what in God's name he was building. Lars explained the concept. Heated stones placed in the trench would radiate warmth through the night without requiring fire. Henry laughed, not unkindly but with genuine bewilderment. Lars was destroying a perfectly good floor to build a hole for rocks. He was spending weeks on construction that served the same purpose as simply keeping a fire burning. Henry left shaking his head, convinced that isolation and grief had damaged Lars's judgment. Lars continued working. By February 20th, the stone walls were complete, and the floor planks had been carefully cut and refitted around the trench opening. Lars spent 3 days preparing for the first proper test. He needed a method to heat stones outside the trench before placing them inside, and he needed tools to handle stones too hot to touch with bare hands. He fashioned tongs from iron barrel hoops, bending and riveting them into crude but functional grippers. He built up his fireplace fire to maximum heat and arranged flat stones directly in the hottest part of the flames. The stones required 2 hours to reach optimal temperature. Lars learned this through trial and careful observation. Stones heated for less than 90 minutes retained warmth for only a few hours. Stones heated beyond 3 hours sometimes cracked from thermal stress. 2 hours produced stones hot enough to be almost dangerous, but stable enough to remain intact. He could not touch them even briefly without severe burns. The iron tongs were essential. On February 23rd, as evening approached, Lars loaded his trench for the first time. He heated 8 large flat stones in the fireplace until they glowed faintly in the dim interior. Using his tongs, he carefully lifted each stone and carried it the 6 feet from fireplace to trench. The heat radiating from each stone was remarkable. He could feel it on his face from 2 feet away. He placed them in the bottom of the stone-lined channel, arranging them to cover the maximum surface area. The stones resting on stone walls created an air gap beneath them, allowing heat to radiate in all directions. He had prepared wooden covers, planks cut to fit precisely over the trench opening. These covers would rest on the stone walls, creating a floor surface while trapping heat below. But for the first test, he left the trench open so he could observe what happened. Heat rose from the stones in visible waves. Within minutes, the entire area around the trench felt noticeably warmer. Within an hour, the temperature difference was dramatic. The space near his sleeping platform, which normally remained cold despite the fireplace burning, had become comfortable. Lars monitored the system through the night. He let his fireplace burn down to minimal coals, maintaining just enough fire to keep the cabin from freezing, but providing far less heat than usual. The stones in the trench compensated completely. At midnight he checked them by holding his hand 6 inches above the surface. Still very hot. At 3 in the morning, still warm enough to radiate significant heat. At dawn, approximately 8 hours after placement, the stones remained warmer than the surrounding air, though no longer hot. The experiment succeeded beyond his expectations. 8 stones heated for 2 hours had provided meaningful warmth for the entire night. They had required no attention, no feeding, no maintenance. He had slept soundly without worry, something he had not done since Thomas died. The theoretical concept had become practical reality, but Lars understood the difference between a successful test and proven reliability. Winter provided plenty of cold nights ahead. The real validation would come when conditions turned severe. Word spread through the scattered trapping community with the peculiar efficiency of frontier gossip. By early March, every trapper within 30 miles had heard that Lars Eriksson had cut a hole in his floor and filled it with hot rocks. The story grew with each retelling. Some versions claimed he had lost his mind after his partner's death. Others suggested he was conducting strange Finnish rituals his grandmother had taught him. A few speculated he was trying to build an indoor sweat lodge. None of the stories treated the innovation with respect. Henry Caldwell returned on March 12th, bringing 2 other trappers with him. Owen Fletcher and Daniel McCreary wanted to see the famous underground foolishness for themselves. Lars welcomed them without defensiveness. He showed them the stone-lined trench, explained the thermal mass principle, and demonstrated how he heated and placed the stones. The 3 visitors examined the construction with expressions ranging from puzzlement to poorly concealed amusement. Henry asked the obvious question, why would anyone spend 6 weeks building this when a fireplace worked perfectly well? Lars explained patiently. A fireplace required constant attention and continuous fuel. The stone trench required heating once per day and could maintain warmth through the entire night without human intervention. A man could sleep safely without worrying about fires going out. During severe weather, when gathering wood became dangerous, the system used fuel far more efficiently. Daniel McCreary laughed outright. He said Lars had built the most complicated solution to a simple problem he had ever seen. Frontier living was hard enough without inventing new ways to make it harder. If a man was worried about his fire going out, he should simply wake up every few hours and add wood like everyone else had done for generations. The solution to cold was fire. It had always been fire. It would always be fire. Building stone walls inside your floor was the work of a man with too much time and too little sense. Owen Fletcher was less mocking but equally skeptical. He acknowledged the craftsmanship was impressive and admitted the trench did seem to produce heat. But he questioned whether the benefit justified the effort. A standard cabin took 4 days to build. Lars had spent weeks on a single feature that served the same basic purpose as keeping a fire burning. In frontier terms, that was poor economy of time and resources. Time spent building was time not spent trapping, hunting, or gathering supplies. Lars did not argue. He had learned that explaining thermal physics to men who thought entirely in terms of flame and fuel was futile. He simply stated that the system worked for him, reduced his wood consumption significantly, and let him sleep without worry. If others preferred traditional methods, that was their choice. Henry named it Eriksson's Folly before leaving, and the name stuck. Over the next month, Lars heard variations: the stone grave, the underground waste, the Finnish fire hole. He ignored them all and continued refining his system, adding more stones, experimenting with covering methods, and documenting how long different stone arrangements retained heat. January of 1842 arrived with deceptive calm. The early part of the month brought cold but manageable weather, the kind of winter conditions that allowed trappers to work their lines and maintain normal routines. Lars had refined his stone heating system through a full year of use. He now kept 12 large flat stones in rotation, heating 6 each evening while 6 cooled enough to be removed and replaced. The rhythm had become automatic. His wood consumption had dropped to roughly 1/3 of what he had burned the previous winter. On January 18th, the sky took on a color Lars recognized. A peculiar yellow-gray that seemed to press down from above, and the air felt heavy despite the cold. Birds disappeared. The usual small sounds of the forest went silent. Lars had seen this twice before in his 9 winters in the mountains. Both times, major storms had followed within hours. He spent that entire day preparing. He heated every stone he owned, filling his trench completely with thermal mass. He brought in additional wood and stacked it inside the cabin where it would stay dry and accessible. He sealed gaps around the door and window with extra rags. He filled every container with water. He prepared as if for siege. The storm began on the evening of January 19th. Snow fell heavily from the start, not the gradual beginning of most storms, but an immediate onslaught. The wind rose to a roar by midnight. By dawn on January 20th, visibility had dropped to 0. Lars could not see his woodpile 20 feet from the door. The wind hit the cabin with physical force that made the walls shake. Snow found its way through gaps that had never leaked before, forming small drifts on the floor near the door. Lars did not light his fireplace. The heat from the stones beneath his floor was sufficient. He lay on his sleeping platform directly above the trench and felt steady warmth rising through the plank covers. The temperature in the cabin remained cold by comfortable standards, but far above the deadly cold outside. He wore a single layer of wool clothing and a blanket. He was not suffering. More importantly, he was using almost no wood. His fuel supply remained virtually untouched. The storm continued without pause through January 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. 5 full days of conditions that made going outside for more than a few minutes genuinely dangerous. Lars ventured out twice daily to check the perimeter and clear snow from the door, but these trips lasted only minutes. He spent the rest of his time inside, comfortable and safe, reading by candlelight, repairing equipment, and sleeping soundly above his stone-lined trench. Each evening, he heated fresh stones in a small fire built solely for that purpose, replacing the stones that had cooled overnight. The system required perhaps 1 hour of attention per day. The rest of the time, the stored heat worked without him, asking nothing, providing everything. The storm ended on the morning of January 25th. The wind died suddenly, leaving a silence so complete it seemed unnatural. Lars stepped outside into a world transformed. Snow had drifted to heights he had never seen, some drifts reaching above the cabin's eaves. The sky was clear, and the cold was absolute, the kind that made exposed skin ache within seconds. He checked his wood supply. He had used perhaps 1/10 of what the same period would have consumed, relying on fireplace heat alone. The stones had carried him through 5 days of the worst weather he had experienced in a decade. He spent January 26 digging out and restocking supplies. On the 27th, he decided to check on his nearest neighbors. Henry Caldwell's cabin was 6 miles southeast. Lars broke trail through waist-deep snow, a journey that took most of the day. He found Henry barely functional. The cabin was ice cold. The fireplace contained only ash. Henry sat wrapped in every blanket he owned, his face gray, his hands shaking. He had run out of wood on the 4th day of the storm. He had burned furniture, broken up a chair, even burned one of his snowshoes in desperation. On the final day, with nothing left to burn, he had simply wrapped himself in blankets and waited for either the storm to end or death to arrive. The storm had ended first, but only just barely. Lars rebuilt Henry's fire and stayed until his neighbor recovered enough to function. Henry said nothing about underground foolishness or wasted effort. He asked quietly how the stone system had performed. Lars described the 5 days, comfortable warmth with minimal wood consumption, no panic, no desperation, no burning furniture. Henry listened without comment, but something in his expression had changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by calculation. 2 days later, Lars found Owen Fletcher 3 miles west. Owen had not run out of wood, but he had suffered severe frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand trying to gather fuel during the storm's peak. He had needed wood badly enough to risk going outside in whiteout conditions. A gust had torn a glove from his hand. By the time he made it back inside, the damage was done. His fingers were black to the second knuckle. He would likely lose at least 2 of them. Owen stared at his damaged hand and asked how Lars had fared. Lars told him. Owen nodded slowly, then asked for details about the stone wall construction. Word arrived in early February through a traveling trader named Jacob Morrison. 2 trappers working the territory 15 miles south had frozen to death during the storm. Their cabin had been found by another trapper passing through. Both men were inside, wrapped in blankets, near a cold fireplace. They had run out of wood sometime during the 4th day. Unlike Henry, they had not survived long enough to see the storm end. Morrison mentioned the deaths matter-of-factly, the way frontier men discussed such things. But then he asked Lars about the heating system that had supposedly kept him comfortable through the entire event. Henry Caldwell began building his own stone-lined trench in March of 1842. He visited Lars 3 times during construction, asking questions about depth, stone selection, and wall stability. His version incorporated modifications. He made his trench slightly longer and added a stone shelf that allowed him to stack 2 layers of heated stones instead of 1. Owen Fletcher, after losing 2 fingers to amputation, built his system in April. His design included a removable iron grate that made loading and unloading stones easier despite his damaged hand. Neither man called it Ericsson's folly anymore. By the winter of 1842 to 1843, 7 trappers in the region had built variations of the underground heat channel. Each builder adapted the basic principle to his own situation and skills. Some used deeper trenches. Others incorporated metal plates salvaged from broken equipment. A few built multiple smaller channels instead of one large trench. The specific details varied, but the core concept remained constant. Thermal mass heating that operated independently of human attention, providing sustained warmth through the long mountain nights without requiring continuous fire. Lars shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked. He explained stone selection, demonstrated heating techniques, and helped troubleshoot problems others encountered during construction. He was not trying to claim credit or establish reputation. He simply knew that good ideas became better when multiple people refined them. Each variation taught him something. Daniel McCreary's double wall design improved insulation. Owen Fletcher's iron grate solved handling problems Lars had struggled with. The collective improvements made the system more practical and accessible. The innovation spread beyond the immediate trapping community. Jacob Morrison mentioned the technique to settlers at Fort Benton. Word reached trading posts along the Missouri River. By 1845, frontier builders as far east as the Dakota Territory were incorporating stone-lined heat channels into cabins and small homesteads. The technique acquired regional names. Some called them heat trenches. Others used the term stone channels or thermal beds. A few still called them Ericsson systems, though Lars never heard that name himself. Lars left the mountains in 1846. The fur trade was collapsing as beaver populations declined and fashion shifted away from felt hats. He sold his cabin and equipment to a young trapper from Ohio and used the proceeds to buy land in Minnesota near other Finnish families who had settled there. He married in 1847 a widow named Margareta, who had 3 children from her first marriage. They built a farm, raised crops and dairy cattle, and lived quietly. Lars built their farmhouse with a stone-lined heat channel beneath the bedroom floor. His neighbors thought it was a clever innovation. None of them knew it had saved lives in the Rockies. Lars died in January of 1879, 33 years after leaving the mountains. He was 67 years old. The obituary in the local newspaper identified him as a farmer and respected community member. It made no mention of his trapping years or the heating system he had developed. His widow and children remembered him as a careful man who built things to last.